had something similar at your hall. He was just one of those really corny guys that he was like a 10-year-old in a 40-year-old man's body. And he was one of these guys that you'd be out in service and he'd say, "Who wants to play 21 questions?" And the people would say, "Nobody wants to play that game. It's from the 70s. We're out in service and this is not the appropriate time." And he would say, "I spy with my little eye." Well, he was just a mild annoyance, I guess is how people would describe him. The big thing with him was he had a guitar that he would play, and he was always trying to impress people, but he wasn't even there'd be kids gathered around him, and he'd start playing. He'd say, "All right, guess this kingdom song." And the kids would be like, what? People at get-togethers was the worst. He'd always, about 60% of the way through any get-together that was going on, he would get his guitar out, and that's when it would end. He'd walk out. People would be trying to play cards or sit at tables and have conversations. He'd walk out with his guitar and say, "Na na 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 na," and start playing. It was like being at a Mexican restaurant where the people in sombreros come out, and he'd walk up to people and they'd be ignoring him, and he'd be just jamming away on his guitar. Probably one of the stupidest things he did was one of the elders got a call on the phone from a householder that had gotten a magazine at their door, and apparently the householder opened up this Watchtower magazine, and someone had written in the margins of the magazine and said, and wrote some note to him and said, "Enjoy this complimentary beef jerky with your reading of this magazine." And there was a Slim Jim that was stuck between the pages, Slim Jim jerky. And the householder called the Kingdom Hall and said, "Are you mocking me?" And the elder didn't know how to tell him that, no, one of our parishioners is an idiot. That was Martin. Martin, despite everything, he was a ministerial servant at the hall, and he was capable. He did the microphones. His dream, though, was to become an elder. And he talked about it all the time. He wanted to be an elder. Well, everyone kind of looked and shook their head. They didn't think he was elder material. But every circuit overseer's visit is when people who are eligible to be moved up the ladder and attain new privileges are reviewed for additional privileges. And upcoming was the CO's visit. Martin was very excited. He wanted it to go well. During the opening talk for the special Tuesday night meeting, the circuit overseer is giving his intro talk for the week, talking about all the service plans and updates. Martin is assigned to the stage. He's doing the microphone duty there, and I guess he can't help himself. That he loves showing off, and he continues going up to the stage and adjusting the microphone. He's doing something up there. He keeps standing in front of the circuit overseer, adjusting the cords, making the mic go up and down to get it perfectly synchronized for the circuit overseer, who eventually says, "Martin, stop doing that. Sit down." Martin's humiliated and he sits down. Well, following the circuit overseer's talk, they have a special theocratic ministry school and service meeting in which there's no sisters that have parts during this. It's all for brothers who are eligible for additional privileges. And as a matter of fact, Martin was going to be giving the #1 talk from the all scripture inspired book. Let me explain how this works. It's usually a chapter reviewing 1 Thessalonians or something like that, and you can, the idea is that it's a 12-minute talk. The idea is that the person will, everyone reads 1 Thessalonians beforehand, and then they review it together. Martin decided to use a prop during his talk, which this is not unheard of. Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to use props during their talks, but for a #1, it's not a usual thing that happens. Martin steps around the corner and brings out an amp. And people say, oh no, he's not going to, but he did. He pulls out a cord, he plugs it into the stage. He reaches around the corner and grabs his electric guitar. People are shuddering. People are dropping their hands into, they're covering their faces. They don't even, there's people looking away. Martin begins giving his talk with his guitar strapped around him, and he's using it, he's talking about how we can live our lives in harmony with Jehovah instead of discord. And he's using this musical interpretation of walking with Jehovah, or something to that effect. And I don't really remember the talk. I just remember looking over and seeing the expression, or I should say non-expression, on the circuit overseer's face. He was absolutely blank face. He and his wife were sitting there silently, just staring at Martin, and the sheer stupidity of Martin. He was doing harmonics and talking about the harmony of Jehovah's life. On the Saturday morning field service, that's the big service day during the circuit overseer. Nobody misses this day. All 100 people are there for the Saturday service. It's the big event. And Martin comes walking in to the Kingdom Hall. He's wearing a golf hat. He's wearing his old suit and tie from the Kingdom Hall, but he's wearing a golf hat. It's the same golf hat that the circuit overseer wears. You see, the circuit overseer, on all the mornings of the week, he has sort of an ensemble he wears. It's kind of he dresses in sort of a country club fashion. He has that Ivy League look where he's wearing a tan overcoat, a light checkered tie, and he has this white gentleman's golf cap that he wears, and that's kind of his look. Well, Martin had ripped off the circuit overseer's. I guess he went to the mall and found the exact same bright white golf hat, and so the circuit overseer is up there, and Martin is sitting there with the same cap too, and people are saying, "Oh God." Well, anyway, after they read the daily text, the circuit overseer solicits from the congregation ideas for the morning's ministry. And Martin starts waving his hand, and the circuit overseer says, "Yes, Martin." And he stands up, and he has Insight on the Scriptures, volumes 1 and 2 in each hand, and he starts talking about how he's going to read to the householder about the antitypical fulfillment of the fall of Jerusalem. And the circuit overseer says, "Martin, I want you to read a scripture," and he refers him to a scripture in the New Testament about people. It was something about people who are new to the truth being as babes and needing the food of children. And he said, "So Martin, your plan is to go door to door with an insight from the Scriptures, stumbling people who need the food of babies, but instead you're going to stumble them with the deep things of God? That's your intention?" And Martin is standing there. The circuit overseer says, "Martin, I want you to, while the rest of us are arranging our car groups and gathering into our cars, I want you to drive home, get your book bag, and put the recommended offers for the month. Get your Watchtower and Awake, put them in your bag, and return and meet us here." And Martin says, "Oh, okay." And he says, "Oh, and take that hat off. Leave it at home." Well, it was an absolutely humiliating week for Martin through and through. And if you're wondering, did Martin get promoted to the position of elder? Well, no, he didn't. He didn't make the cut. They selected someone else. But the good news for Martin, though, was that he was going to get to give his first public talk. And he was very excited about this. About a month later, Martin did get the privilege of giving his first Sunday talk for the first time, and it was a doozy. I was there that Sunday. I remember that he was walking up to the stage and he was carrying with him 2 giant mason jars. And people started saying, oh no. He was about to rip off the circuit overseer's exact demonstration that he had done during his visit, in which the circuit overseer demonstrated for the congregation through the use of his own props. What he did was he had these 2 jars that he had a card table set up on the stage, and he had these 2 jars. One of them was empty and one of them was filled with lima beans, dried lima beans. And the circuit overseer held up a golf ball, and he said it represented our service to Jehovah. Now, sometimes in the congregation you will hear people complaining that serving Jehovah, they can't find a way to fit it into their busy schedule of life. And he said, this, for example here, this jar filled with beans, each one of these beans can represent a responsibility you have in your daily life. Driving the children to school, picking your kids up from school, going to work every day, mowing the yard. Each one of these beans represents a small responsibility. Now we'll take this golf ball of service to Jehovah, and he sets it on top of the pile of beans inside the mason jar, and he tries to put the cap on the jar. Well, they're correct. It just doesn't fit. The circuit overseer says, let's try something different. Let's do it Jehovah's way now. He takes the golf ball, he sets it at the bottom of the empty mason jar, he takes the lima beans and he pours them into the opposite mason jar. He gently screws the cap on. Fits perfectly when you do it Jehovah's way. And everyone in the congregation looks at each other and they clap. Even a couple people stood up and started clapping. It was such a good representation of how the life of a Jehovah's Witness can work. Well, Martin, everyone had just seen this demonstration. The glamour of it is all gone. He's going to rip off the same exact demonstration again. And everyone is just dreading this. Why is he? And he gets up there. He has a jar of jelly beans. And I guess that was his own spin on it. He changed it up a little bit and made it his own. Well, and then he says, well, some of you in the congregation probably feel like serving Jehovah is too hard. And you can't do it all because it doesn't work. Well, you probably think that, right? Well, you're wrong. It does. And he said, and I can prove it to you. You see, this golf ball, it's the stuff that we have to do for Jehovah. All stuff we don't want to do, but it's necessary. And people are shaking their head and just going, oh my God. Well, anyway, he's like, I bet you think that you can't fit all this stuff into one jar. Well, you're wrong about that. And he shows that he can't screw he puts the golf ball on top of jelly beans. It doesn't fit. Well, then he takes a golf ball and puts it in the other jar. And he starts pouring the jelly beans in there when some of them start even spilling out. It's clumsy and stupid, but there's a problem. He starts filling up the jar, but it's overflowing. I don't know what he did wrong, but he fills the jar up to the top and it's overflowing and the jelly beans are at the top. And he's like, well, that's not supposed to be happening. I don't know what went wrong. And everyone is shaking their head, and people are turning red. It's so embarrassing. Well, Martin, he gets the cap off. He's making a mess everywhere, and he tries to screw the cap onto this mason jar. It's not going on. He's like, sometimes Jehovah seems like yeah. Well, finally, he just through sheer force he twists the cap on, and he just barely gets it on. Finally, after a belabored thing of 2 minutes long, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. And it's finally over, and Martin says, well, you see, sometimes it may be a struggle and it may seem hard, but with Jehovah's help, we can always fit our service into his life. And he pats the top of the jar, and it explodes. he'd walk up to people and they'd be ignoring him, and he'd be just jamming away on his guitar. Probably one of the stupidest things he did was one of the elders got a call on the phone from a householder that had gotten a magazine at their door, and apparently the householder opened up this Watchtower magazine, and he was just one of those really corny guys that he was like a 10-year-old in a 40-year-old man's body, and he was one of these guys that you'd be out in service and he'd say, "Who wants to play 21 questions?" And the people would say, "Nobody wants to play that game. It's from the 70s. We're out in service and this is not the appropriate time." And he would say, "I spy with my little eye." And you probably had something similar. What? People at get-togethers was the worst. He'd always, about 60% of the way through any get-together that was going on, he would get his guitar out, and that's when it would end. He'd walk out. People would be trying to play cards or sit at tables and have conversations. He'd walk out with his guitar and say, "Na na 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 na," and start playing. It was like being at a Mexican restaurant where the people in sombreros come out, and well, he was just a mild annoyance, I guess is how people would describe him. The big thing with him was he had a guitar that he would play, and he was always trying to impress people, but he wasn't even there'd be kids gathered around him, and he'd start playing. He'd say, "All right, guess this kingdom song." And the kids would be like, "Ah."